January 20th, 1996. When you look back over your life, you can often see in retrospect the days and the events that were turning points. You can look back and see days and events that seemed to change everything. And it wasn't surprising or unexpected for me that January 20th, 1996 would be life-changing, but perhaps I underestimated the impact of the change. We have a tendency to do that, when you're young. You don't actually realize what you're getting yourself into oftentimes. But the months leading up to that day, they now seem just kind of like a blink of an eye to me, but at the time, it felt like a lifetime. Our first date was a double date. Carrie and I went bowling and we had pizza with Lindy and her boyfriend at the time. The double date was followed by a Valentine's date just a few days later, which was followed up by us hanging out pretty much all the time, which turned into an official boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and that was followed up with me leaving for college, and then a breakup, and then a reconciliation that we both kind of knew that was probably for good. For the fall of 1995, our relationship was a long-distance relationship. I was 300 miles away at college, but we talked every day on the phone. This was much to the chagrin of the fellow classmates who lived on Boatman 3rd dorm at Ozark Christian College, because this was the day before cell phones. And so there was one payphone in the middle of the hallway that everybody used for communicating. And so I was always on the phone, and it was also the chagrin of my parents who saw their long-distance phone bill skyrocket. That we were getting married was pretty much a foregone conclusion. She had gone with me to pick out the ring. We kind of knew what was going on. But maybe it was a long-distance relationship. Maybe it was the fact that the breakup that we went through previously was kind of tough, but I was a bit insecure. I often joked to her that I was just going to get it over with and propose to her over the phone. She said, "Don't you dare do that." And I often asked her, I said, "Carrie, are you sure you want to marry me?" And she would, in the fact that she'd get to the point where she would get frustrated. And she'd say, "Do not ask me that again unless you have a ring in your hand." But January 20th, 1996, that was the day. Well, as I was thinking about and praying about this sermon last week, preparing for this day, that day kept coming to mind. I was a little confused by it, to be honest, because I wasn't quite sure what it had to do with Easter. Today is all about the power of God through the resurrection of Jesus, the single most important human event ever. Today we celebrate the fulfillment of God's plan. You see, God never intended for the world to be the way it is. This is not the way God meant it to be. He created it to be perfect. He created it to be unblemished, to be a wonderful place to be where there be fellowship and unhindered love between Him and His creation, between Him and mankind. But of course, we know that love without a choice is not love at all. And so God said, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can either choose to follow my instructions, my will for your life, and if you do that, we will have unhindered fellowship, or you can do your own thing if you want. But that has consequences." And of course, we chose to do our own thing. And that brought separation. We messed it up. We messed up the perfect world that God created. But God didn't give up. In fact, from that point forward, His plan was put into action. It started with Abraham. It was Abraham that God said, "Go to the land I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation." That nation became Israel, which showed the world what it meant to be in a covenant relationship with God. And then, of course, out of Israel came this baby named Jesus. And, of course, His life gave us an example to live by. And then, of course, the death that He died on a cross, beaten, humiliated. But, of course, today, the resurrection is what we celebrate. That He is risen, that the tomb was empty, and as Philippians 2 said, that God lifted Him to the highest place, that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, every tongue confess to the glory of God the Father. And so Easter, the day we celebrate, that was the day. And so how do you put into words, though, what God offers us through the death and resurrection of Jesus, especially because you already know the story? Some people say, Christmas and Easter should be easy things to preach for a preacher. They're actually the hardest ones. Because everybody knows about Christmas and everybody knows about Easter. So how do you put into words what God offers us through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Cynthia M. Campbell said this. She said, whether we are seeking to express the mystery of creation or redemption, the power of the cross or the glory of the resurrection, the most we can do is reach for image and metaphor, poetry and song, because what we are trying to express extends so far beyond the reach of ordinary language. That is true. The truth of today, it stands beyond anything that I can communicate. And so we're going to today depend on or borrow the words of the prophet Isaiah. If you have a Bible, you can open up to Isaiah chapter 25 in the Old Testament. The words will also be on the screen this morning. And it may seem a bit odd at face value to look at the Old Testament to communicate the story of Jesus and his resurrection. I mean, the Old Testament was before Jesus was born. Jesus is not ever explicitly mentioned by name in the Old Testament. Easter happened a long time after the words of Isaiah were written. But when we remember that everything in God's Word points to Jesus, it makes a little more sense. In fact, the book of Isaiah sort of serves as a dual role. It was a communication to Israel about the ups and downs about that nation, but it was also the foreshadowing of what was to come in and through Christ. In fact, this section of Isaiah reflects the sequence of events that I shared just a bit ago, that Isaiah 24, it talks about the judgment of God, which reflects the status of separation between man and God because of sin. And then if you fast forward to Isaiah 27, that talks about the restoration of God's people, signaled by the sounding of a trumpet, which of course reflects the return of Christ and the ushering in of eternity. And in between those two chapters is chapter 25, right in the middle, which reflects the promise that's made possible through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we see it in Isaiah 25, starting with verse 6. On this mountain the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. In that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trusted in him and he saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. Now this passage is one of promise. It's one of promise that which Easter, the day of Easter, made all of this promise fulfillment possible. And according to this passage in Isaiah, the death and resurrection of Jesus accomplishes three big things for God's people. First of all, we see that because of Easter, God takes people from the valley to the mountain. Now, this passage, it doesn't specifically mention the valleys of life. We don't have the word valley in this passage, but maybe it's because we don't really need to be familiarized with the valleys of life. That perhaps we're all too familiar already with the valleys of life. And so maybe the valleys that God will lift us from to the mountaintop, maybe it's the valley of loneliness. You know, we are in an increasingly lonely society. We are more and more isolated. We live in a world where when you get up tomorrow to go to work, you can get in your car. We've talked about this before. You can get in your car in your garage, open your garage door, pull your car out, go to work, drive back home, pull into your garage, close the garage door, and never see a human being. Unless you have to because you're at work. We are isolated. We are separated from one another in so many ways. But maybe it's not just a physical isolation. Maybe it's an isolation based on our experience. That maybe we're going through something in our lives that others just don't quite seem to understand or get the scope of and how it's impacting us. Maybe we're going through something that it just feels like we've burdened people for too long and it's just like, I got nowhere to turn anymore. Maybe it's even something that we're going through or experiencing that is something that other people would shun, we think. But there's the valley of loneliness, or maybe it's the valley of emptiness. That no matter what we do, no matter what we try, no matter how we try to fill that void, we can't shake that empty feeling. Maybe it's the valley of exhaustion. That we just feel like life has just kind of sucked the energy right out of us. We're just tired. Or maybe it's the valley of sadness. We just can't catch a break, that it's one thing after another, and there's just no good that seems to be happening. And anything that does happen that's good is quickly, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we've all been there in some way. We've been in the valley, no matter what the valley might be. And some might suggest that life is often defined by those valleys. But this is what God promises in verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, and the finest of wines. Of course, the mountain here is a contrast of experience. We often talk about a mountaintop experience in contrast with the valleys of life, right? The valleys of life are the things you slog through and you struggle through, and it's the bad times, and those are not enjoyable at all. But then if you have a mountaintop experience, it's one that's full of energy, full of exuberance, full of excitement, full of just rejuvenation for your life. And so you see the two contrasts. But also we see through Scripture that biblically the mountain was symbolic in itself. A lot of great stuff happens in Scripture on a mountain. Moses comes in contact with God and brings the covenant 10 commandments back to the Israelites. Elijah kills the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Jesus in the New Testament, he does a sermon on the mount. The Great Commission he did from a mountain. When he ascended back into heaven, he ascended from a mountain. And so this is what we have, is a mountain that God brings us from the valley to the mountain. And this is the best part, though. This is what we find on the mountain according to this passage. We find a legit party, like a serious party. Now, the feast of rich food for all people speaks to the type of food that was reserved for the wealthiest people, the members of royalty. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of good food in my life. I've had too much good food in my life, but I've only had a couple of bona fide fancy meals. You know, something more fancy than like Chili's or something like that. I've only had a couple of fancy meals. One of them was a few years ago. A few years ago, Carrie and I were in Indianapolis for the North American Christian Convention. And also at that convention were some friends of ours from the church that we served in Ohio, a minister that I worked with, and we decided that we were going to take Kurt and Leanne out for a nice meal. We really wanted to make it a nice meal. And so we were in downtown Indianapolis, and we looked at a lot of different options, but we settled on one option. It was St. Elmo's Steakhouse in downtown Indy. I don't know if you've heard of St. Elmo's Steakhouse, but it is one of the most famous steakhouses in the United States. I'd never eaten there before, but I knew this restaurant was famous for several things. First of all, steak, right? It's a steakhouse. The steaks are good, they're big, they're juicy, they're delicious, they're wonderful. And then they're famous for their shrimp cocktail appetizer. They have some kind of special way of making the cocktail sauce. It's a little bit spicy. I think they put horseradish in it and different things, but it's world famous. People go all over the place just to get their shrimp cocktail appetizer. Then they're famous for their history. They've been in the same location since 1902 and have been in business that long, but maybe perhaps they're most famous because famous people eat there. If you go to their website, you can see a list of some of the people that have eaten there. Here, some of the people that I took off the list. Will Rogers ate there, fellow Oklahoman, an Okie there. He ate there. John F. Kennedy ate at the steakhouse. Bette Midler ate at the steakhouse. Adam Sandler, and believe it or not, even Vanilla Ice ate at St. Elmo's Steakhouse. And so we made reservations. And when we arrived, the maitre d' took us to our table, and the waitstaff, they were dressed in full black tie attire, tuxedos for the men and long black dresses for the women. And the world-famous shrimp cocktail, I ordered it. It had 4 shrimp, and it was $16. The cheapest steak was $40. And it felt so fancy that when the waiter asked Leanne a question about her dinner, she said, yeah. And then she quickly corrected herself. She said, I mean, yes, because you don't want to speak improperly in this restaurant. And so we ordered and we ate, and it was a truly glorious meal. And I picked up the check, and I'm hoping to have that paid off by next November. And the prophet Isaiah tells us that St. Elmo's ain't got nothing on the feast that God is going to throw for us on that mountain. And he is going to pick up the bill. And that's not even mentioning the wine. Now, the King James Version, this is how I love what they say, how the King James Version puts verse 6. It says, in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the lees well refined. I like that line there. Wines on the lees well refined. Unless you work at a vineyard You probably don't know what that means. I didn't know what it means, so I Googled it. And here's what it means. It means that the lees is when you leave a barrel of wine to age for so long that the yeast starts to settle at the bottom and kind of make a crusty thing at the bottom. It sounds kind of gross, but apparently when that happens, you get some of the best and strongest wine there is to offer. And so this is the kind of wine that is there. Now, I don't know much about wine, so I Googled it. I Googled most expensive wine, and here's some options for you. Here's the Chateau Margaux. It was made in 1787. It cost $225,000 for that bottle. It's from actually Thomas Jefferson's wine cellar. Now, unfortunately, if you're like, oh yeah, I want that wine, I got bad news for you. It's actually not available any longer because a waiter in the Four Seasons Hotel in New York City knocked it off a shelf and it broke. People speculate that the wine was probably going to be worth more, upwards of $500,000, but the insurance only paid $225,000. That's where that number came from. But if you want to buy some wine and some good wine, you could go with the Chateau Lafite. Now, this is also brewed in 1787, also believed to come from Thomas Jefferson's wine cellar. Its THJ initials are etched in the glass, and if you want a bottle of that wine, it will cost you $156,450. Pretty good wine. And the prophet Isaiah says that you can bet that God's wine, first of all, it ain't coming in no box. Sorry, box wine people. It's not coming in a box. And Thomas Jefferson ain't got nothing on God's wine cellar. But of course, this promise is not just about steak and wine. It's about God inviting us to be lifted from the depths of despair in this world to the mountaintop experience that never ends. But another major thing that Christ's death and resurrection accomplished, because of Easter, God brings His people from death to life. Now, the only sure thing in life, of course, are death and taxes, and neither one is very pleasant to talk about. And to put it bluntly and a bit crassly to you today, death sucks. And it sucks on several levels. First of all, we think about it from the physical perspective. That death is the mark of finality, both literally and symbolically. I've shared this with you before, but I've sensed this finality a couple times in my life. Back in 2011, I was sitting in my dad's congregation, who was a preacher at the time, and I was listening to him preach. And while he was preaching, a cell phone went off. Now, that's happened to me several times. You know, cell phone will go off while I'm preaching. No big deal. It happens. But this time, it was actually the preacher's cell phone that went off. My dad's cell phone rang. And I was a little shocked when he picked it up and he answered it while in the middle of his sermon. Now, I don't know whether it was because he knew something was wrong or why he did it, but he answered it, and it was his sister. And found out that his mother, my grandmother, who was in the hospital for minor surgery, had a stroke. And when we zoomed up right after church as quickly as we could to get up there, and I remember my dad telling me what he prayed. He said, I just prayed to God, give me one more cup of coffee with my mom. One more cup of coffee. I prayed that exact same prayer on December 16, 2016. My mom called and said that Dad had been in an accident. I knew nothing about his status, knew not what kind of shape he was in, and I found myself praying out loud, God, please just give me one more cup of coffee with my dad. Fortunately, my dad did have that cup of coffee with his mother, and I have had many cups of coffee with my dad since then as well. But I know that there are those in this room that have prayed similar prayers and have had different results. And the reality is that we will all run out of time. And that sucks. But then you have the legacy perspective. Death is ultimately the limit or the boundary that every one of us strives against. We can try to delay it. We can eat right, be in shape, all that kind of stuff. But everyone, even the healthiest people, die, and with death comes this limit and boundary of our lives that puts to an end to whatever we've tried to accomplish. I believe it's human nature to want to leave behind a legacy, and we try to do that in various ways. Maybe it's our job that maybe you want to build up your business or whatever the case may be to the point where when you leave that it's going to be strong. Maybe it's some other accomplishment that you have some goal that you want to accomplish so that whenever you're dead and gone, that your name will live on because of that. A lot of us look to our family to serve as our legacy. Do we want to raise our kids right? Do we want our kids to raise their kids right so that long after we're gone, our family will be strong? But no matter what we choose to be our legacy, there comes a limit and there comes a boundary to those efforts for all of us. There's a show that I watched, my brother got me into. I kind of watch it occasionally. It's called Forged in Fire. You ever seen Forged in Fire? Okay, Forged in Fire is basically, it's a show, it's a contest in which participants design and build a blade of some sort. It could be a knife, it could be a sword, something like that. In the contest, they give them sort of criteria. They go, you're going to do a samurai sword, or you're going to do a Bowie knife, or whatever the case may be. And they say, here's your materials, and here's what you got to do. And the contestants submit their blade to the judges, and ultimately one person wins the contest and wins $10,000. But the contest is timed. And they have a host that at the end of the allotted time, he says, time's up, put down your tools. And whatever progress the contestant has made at that point, they must submit that progress to the judges at that point. See, death is like that for us. Death is like that host that says, time's up, put down your tools. No matter what you were building as a legacy in your life, no matter what you were striving for in your life, death shows up and says, okay, time's up. Whatever you have done at this point is what you have to submit. And that kind of sucks. But of course, you have the spiritual perspective as well. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, the wages of sin is death, meaning that when we sin, what we deserve, what we earn from that is death. And death, of course, is not immediately physical, but it is spiritual, that we are immediately separated from God. And as we've talked about a lot recently, you've got this picture of eternity, that heaven and hell is not something that we are judged, and then all of a sudden we go to heaven or we go to hell based on whatever. It's basically a situation in which we start off in God's grace. As an infant, we start off pure without sin, and then we come to that age of accountability and rebel. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And what that does is it takes us from this road that leads to eternity with God, and it puts us on this road that leads to destruction and separation from God eternally. And so what happens, unfortunately, is that if we are on this road of spiritual death, when the spiritual intersects with the physical, time's up. We're no longer able to ask God to take us from that road of destruction and place us back on the road of fellowship with Him. And so, you intersect those roads, the results are eternal, but this is what Isaiah 25 says, in verse 7. On this mountain He will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Now that means that through the resurrection of Jesus, we're able to reverse the effects of death through the same power of that resurrection. And it's not just, it's every effect. That no longer are we limited by physical death. That John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. That physical death is no longer the end of our life. No longer does our legacy have to be temporary or short-lived. Colossians 3:2 says, set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. And when we do that, when we set our mind on things above and not on earthly things, then we can make impacts in this world that will echo into eternity. And no longer do we need to be separated from God and headed for destruction. I read it before, for the wages of sin and death is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. And the death and resurrection of Jesus allows God's people to throw off the shroud of death and to live in a new way. But there is one more major thing the death and resurrection of Jesus accomplishes. Because of Easter, God takes His people from suffering to salvation. The truth is, death sucks. But let me let you in on a little secret. Sometimes life sucks too. There are a couple of reasons that I think life sucks. First of all, because I think life is a struggle because the world is broken. As I mentioned before, I said God never intended for the world to be broken. And that's absolutely true. God intended for the world to be perfect, so that it will be perfect fellowship, no death, no anything of that nature, no struggle, no turmoil, but just continual fellowship with Him. That's what He intended. But not only did sin cause problems for us personally, the introduction of sin into the world broke the world. And after sin came death and decay and destruction, and those things still seem to reign around us. We've already talked about death, but the reality is we have continual reminders of death each and every day of our lives. People we know, people we don't know, people we love, people we see on the news. Death, there's a continual reminder of death and the reality of that. When it comes to decay, things are breaking down all around us. For example, my body, I'm getting old, and so I'll wake up. Like this morning, I rammed my elbow against a shower, and so I got done, and it was hurting quite a bit, and I said, well, I guess that's just going to hurt for the rest of my life now. You know that feeling? My body's breaking down. It happens. So you see that, and of course, not only my body, it's my stuff. My car needs air conditioner work. My house needs some ceiling work. Things just break down and decay. We see that everywhere we go. And then when it comes to destruction, look around. We're rebuilding, but surely Hurricane Harvey taught us a lot about destruction. And we see that on a regular basis in our lives. And that death and decay and destruction, it just makes life hard sometimes, and it causes us to struggle. But also, life is a struggle because we mess up. I don't know if he said it first, but Bill Murray said this on Twitter. He said, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes that reason is you're stupid and you make bad decisions. And all God's people said amen, right? I mean, let's be honest. I don't know about you, but I can relate to that most of the time, if there's a struggle in my life, most of the time it's not because someone mistreated me or some kind of thing happened to me. It's because I was stupid and made a bad decision. And I brought it on myself. But here's the good news, verse 9. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and He will remove His people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. Be it the tears of struggles from the realities of this broken world or the disgrace that comes with the realities of our mistakes, the power of the resurrection of Jesus allows God to change suffering to salvation for His people. From the valley to the mountain, from death to life, from suffering to salvation. In Easter, that was the day. January 20th, 1996. That was the day. I'd already made the preparations and I had gotten ready. I had the ring, I had 3 carnations, I had taken a shower, I dressed up in my olive green, double-breasted suit, and I called Carrie from my parents' house just to make sure she was in her dorm room. Caller ID was a luxury option that she didn't have in her dorm room, so when I called, it was not hard to convince her that I was calling from my dorm room 300 miles away. I engaged in some small talk for a while, and then I pretended that someone else needed to use the phone. That was a regular occurrence with one payphone. I said, hey, so-and-so needs to use the phone, but I'll call you right back. She says, no problem. And so as soon as I hung up, I jumped into my little blue Mazda pickup truck, and I drove to this spot. This is the actual spot. Her dorm was on the 2nd floor there. It was circled there, and I parked right outside her window. I had a bag phone at the time, one of those 20 minutes for $20 a month, and I plugged that sucker into the cigarette lighter, and I fired it up, and I dialed her number. This time I skipped the small talk, and I went right to the question. I said, are you sure you want to marry me? She tried to change the subject, but I persisted. I said, Carrie, are you sure you want to marry me? And her response was a bit curt. She said, Christopher, stop. So I asked her again, of course, Carrie, are you sure you want to marry me? And finally, I got the response I was looking for. She said, I told you already. Don't ask me that question again until you have a ring in your hand. I said, Carrie, look out the window. She said, what? I said, look out the window. So I saw the blinds open, and I saw her eyes peek out, and there I was on one knee in my olive green double-breasted suit with a ring in my hand. And I did exactly what she told me not to do. I proposed to her over the phone. And she said yes. Church, here's why that story was on my mind this week. Here's the reality of Easter. Most people know the story, and most people know about the event. Generally speaking, if you ask your neighbors or your coworkers or friends what Easter was all about, they would probably know that it commemorates the resurrection of Jesus, whether they are Christian or not, whether they believe or not. And it's likely that when I shared with you the promises of Isaiah 25, that you weren't surprised, and you probably already associated those things with the story and the event of Easter. But here's the thing. I believe wholeheartedly that God does not want us to see Easter as a story, but as an invitation. And God does not want us to view the resurrection only as an event, but as a proposal. You see, now you know the story of my marriage proposal. If you're a hopeless romantic, you may be thinking, oh, how sweet, that's really nice. If you're a cynic like me, you might think, well, he was really a cheeseball, wasn't he? Regardless of your reaction, me telling you that story is not probably going to change your life one bit. But there is one person whose life was directly and profoundly impacted by that event. And she's sitting up in the crow's nest right now. And the reason it changed her life is because for her, it's not just a story. It was not just an event. It was a proposal, an invitation. And so, church, today is not just about the story of Easter. And we aren't here just to recount the event of the resurrection. We are here to remember and realize that Easter is an invitation, that Easter is a proposal. That through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God invites us to a new life in which we are invited to move from the valley to the mountaintop, from death to life, and from suffering to salvation. That Easter is the moment in which God gets down on one knee and says that if we are willing, He wants to be our Savior. Easter is the ultimate proposal from God to mankind, made possible by the sacrifice of Jesus and the power of the resurrection. Easter. That was the day. But that's not the end. January 20th, 1996, that was the day. But of course, that was not the end. That was only the beginning. As important and as wonderful as that day was, and it's fun to recount and tell the story about how that happened, I celebrate that day mostly because it made another day possible. July 13th, 1996. You see, on January 20th, I wasn't just offering Carrie a ring, but a new life. And my hope was based on what Carrie had learned about me during our courtship, that she would conclude that living life with me would allow her to thrive and would be much better than without me or with someone else. And my hope was that I could spend the rest of my life with her. But that didn't officially start until July 13th, 1996, because on that day, Carrie and I stood before God and our friends and our family, and we made official what we had both committed to, a life of unconditional love. And from that day forward, every aspect of our lives was intertwined. Every bit of our lives was intertwined. From that day forward, we may not have always been together physically, but since that day, we were no longer individuals, but husband and wife who were bonded together. That's what January 20th was about. It was about an invitation and a proposal of a new life that would find its fullness on July 13th. You see, Easter was a day in which that day in which God ultimately proclaimed His love for mankind, and He invited us back into fellowship with Him. And God's hope was that based on what we learned about His love and power and mercy and grace through the death and resurrection of Jesus, that we would conclude that living with God as our Savior would allow Him to do exactly what Isaiah 25 promises, to take us from the valley to the mountain, from death to life, and from suffering to salvation. And the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's an amazing event in and of itself. And we celebrate that event today, but we celebrate that event today because of another day that Easter makes possible. We read about it in Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away." You see, when Christ returns, He's going to usher in the new heaven and the new earth. And the promises of Isaiah 25 will be fulfilled, and they'll be full and tangible in the lives of those who have accepted God's proposal. And from that day forward, it will be a day of eternal celebration, of life, of comfort. From that day forward, we will be with God just as God intended. And we celebrate that day because we look back and we look forward. We celebrate today because we look back. and we look forward. We look back to see what Christ has done through us, what God did through us through Christ, that He willingly gave His Son, His only Son, so that we might have life, that Jesus willingly and obediently submitted to death on the cross. And we look forward to that day when Christ will return and return this world to the state God always intended. And we can celebrate because both of those things are realities. But let us not forget that Easter is not just about an event that happened in the past, and it's not about a day that will happen in the future. God offers us the power of Easter right now in our lives. January 20th was the day I proposed to Carrie, and what a cool day that was. July 13th was the day I married her, and it was one of the best days of my life. Not because the day itself was all that great, but because of what it did and what it brought to fruition. But in between January 20th and July 13th, there was a time of active anticipation. It was a time of anticipation because I couldn't wait to marry this woman. I could not wait to be married. I could not wait until we finally became husband and wife. And it was an active time because we had work to do. Yeah, we had to prepare for the wedding and make plans and do all that kind of stuff. But we also began living out the love and commitment that we had made to one another. That even though we were not yet married, we built our relationship. That even though we did not yet live together, we spent as much time as we could together. That even though there were still limits to our love and to our knowledge of one another and to our intimacy, we still grew closer to one another, and we lived in an active anticipation of the start of the fullness of our new lives. What an amazing event Easter was. The tomb was empty. Jesus sent the women to go and spread the good news. God raised His Son from the dead. What an amazing invitation and proposal of God to say, see how much I love you, now will you let me be your Savior? And what it will be, incredible day it will be for those who've accepted the proposal when Christ returns, when the fullness of what God intended becomes reality once again. But make no mistake, right now, this is a time of active anticipation. It was Pastor S.M. Lockridge who famously preached these words. He did it better, but I'm going to try it anyway. He said, it's Friday. Jesus is praying. Peter's asleep. Judas is betraying. The Sunday's coming. It's Friday. Pilate's struggling. The council is conspiring. The crowd is vilifying. They don't even know the Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The disciples are running like sheep without a shepherd. Mary's crying. Peter is denying. But they don't know the Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The Romans beat my Jesus. They robe Him in scarlet. They crown Him with thorns, but they don't know the Sunday's coming. It's Friday. See Jesus walk into Calvary, His blood dripping, His body stumbling, and His spirit's burdened. But you see, it's only Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The world's winning. People are sinning, and evil's grinning. It's Friday. The soldiers nail my Savior's hands to the cross. They nail my Savior's feet to the cross. And then they raise Him up next to criminals. It's Friday, but let me tell you something. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The disciples are questioning what has happened to their king, and the Pharisees are celebrating that their scheming has been achieved, but they don't know. It's only Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. He's hanging on the cross, feeling forsaken by His Father, left alone and dying. Can nobody save Him? Oh, it's Friday. Sunday's coming. It's Friday. The earth trembles. The sky grows dark. My King yields His spirit. It's Friday. Hope is lost. Death is won. Sin is conquered. And Satan's just a laughing. It's Friday. Jesus is buried. A soldier stands guard, and a rock is rolled into place. But it's Friday. It's only Friday, and Sunday is coming. Church, I'm here to tell you, Sunday is here. Yes, we celebrate the fact that the tomb is empty. Yes, we celebrate the fact that He is risen. We celebrate the fact that God's Son gave His life and was raised again. And yes, we look forward to that day when death has been swallowed up in victory. We look forward to that day when God wipes away the tears from our eyes. We look forward to that day when God will forever dwell with His people. But church, as much as in the meantime, it might feel like Friday in this world that's characterized by valleys, in this world that's overshadowed by death, in this world that's defined by suffering. It might feel like Friday, but Sunday is here. It's here. And because Sunday is here, we don't have to wait until heaven to experience God's intentions for our lives. God sees our valleys of loneliness, and He wants to give us the comfort of the Holy Spirit. God sees our valleys of emptiness, and He wants to give us the fullness of purpose of life that He designed us for. God sees our valleys of exhaustion, and He wants to give our souls true rest. He sees our valleys of sadness, and He wants to give us peace that surpasses understanding. God sees the finality of physical death and says, not anymore. For my people, death is nothing more than a transition. God sees the fleeting efforts of life and tells us that we can live lives that echo throughout eternity. God sees the spiritual death caused by our sin and says, no more, my Son took care of that. God sees the struggle of the broken world, and He helps people usher in His kingdom so that His will can be done on earth as it is in heaven. God sees the struggle of our imperfections, and He says, my grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect in your weakness. And God wants nothing more than to restore this world to the way He always intended it. And someday He will, but in the meantime, we don't have to wait to experience God's love, grace, mercy, and power. Easter wasn't just a story, it was a proposal, and it was an invitation. And so how will we respond? Let's stand as we sing.